Hello, Daniel.
Hello, Adam. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm starting to enjoy the spring and just thinking about what my last few months will be like before my artificial intelligence super intelligent overlords arrive and change everything.
I thought artificial intelligence supervisor or PI or something.
That'd be better.
Well, I think they're still a way off, right? Uh, in a way, if we look at what people like to talk about right now is about AI, because it comes back in waves. But somebody said actually that ChatGPT is actually some kind of hyper Eliza on steroids, if you like. So essentially, it's much more powerful, but essentially, it's in terms of content, it's quite vacuous, and it doesn't claim to be anything else, right? It doesn't claim to evaluate the truth. It more claims to put sentences together in a way that sounds good. In this sense, it's not much different than some third-rate politician, for example, that doesn't really understand the matters at hand, but knows how things fit together to make a convincing case, and maybe eloquent. And these people can get quite far, as we know, especially that as further up you are in the hierarchy in deciding things, feedback is far more indirect. So that's why it's so hard to evaluate good performance in politics or in management. It's possible, but it's very hard. And there's a reason why people all love KPIs, or key performance indicators, for those who don't like the abbreviations. So the AI is it's still on the language level. It's not on the content level. That is, I think the one thing that we have to keep in mind. If should we get worried? Yeah, we should get worried. It's a good thing to be worried. It's better to be alert than to be too cavalier and be surprised if things go south. The problem is, in my opinion, not currently the AI taking over. If we talk about it, not currently. There are two problems. Problem number one is this AI is such a powerful tool that it can make a lot of jobs obsolete, simply obsolete. Basically, if you can perform the job of 20 white-collar workers, okay, who will do the work? I mean, it's much of the
paralegals, like the whole paralegal profession could be in huge trouble, because you can have one person just supervise, basically one person empowered with a mass language model, as if they have an army of, better than an army of paralegals under them. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, what you will probably need is at some point, but again, I don't think that is a unsurmountable obstacle. A parse or something that checks correctness, that checks, okay, this is a logical argument. But we do have, for example, we have, for example, when we do theorem provers, the provers and the checkers. Checking is always easier than proving, right? So in general, checking is no harder than proving. You can check that a proof is correct, even if you would not be able to come up with a proof yourself. And that is generally, I would say, the case. So I would say it's a matter of time when, especially in a confined environment such as law, you would be able to actually come up with logic checkers. It will be not as easy for general knowledge. General knowledge is far too wide and scattered, but I think in specialized fields it might be possible. So the first worry I would have is actually job destruction. There's always a statement, oh no, we always found other jobs. That is not always true. Some jobs actually disappear. Now, okay, they moved up the scale. They moved from manual labor to less manual labor or more sophisticated labor, but not everybody can do that, right? And essentially,
It's
as
not trivial. And you might be in a, like, either, whether it's a phase of life or just a circumstance, like, it's just, that is not a luxury you have, which is retraining for a different job. And you
yes,
prepared for disruptive change, and you were planning your life in a certain way. And whether it's situational or just like you're not up to the challenge, like you optimize yourself in this way, the retooling is just not an option. That's, yeah.
exactly. And the problem with the gig thinking, that you jump from gig to gig, is you only get shallow skills. Okay, so you know one thing, you can do it, but your skill never will develop to a level where you become a master at whatever you do. If you're not, for example, if you cook in a fast food restaurant, you will not become a chef serving at really top-notch restaurants. You will just know that thing, and you move to another job, you know, bicycle driving, transporting food from one point to another. You may be a competent bicycle driver, but again, you will not compete in Tour de France. Okay, you could say we don't need that. But the real problem is that not everybody has the time to become sufficiently useful in a job that they will not immediately be replaceable. That is essentially the problem that we're facing. And that population will have an issue. Now, there are jobs that are very hard to replace for quite a while, I think. One is, of course, everything that's craftsmanship, everything that's, you know, maintenance of houses, building, all these very, very physical jobs that are still extremely difficult to do by machines and cannot be standardized easily. That is something that's going to stay for a while. What's also going to stay, I keep saying that, criminals will not go away, so cybersecurity is going to be a big topic for a long time. I don't think that topic is going to go away anytime soon. But as you say, anything that's a white-collar job, that's kind of organizing stuff, writing simple scripts, even more complicated scripts. The problem is that the people who are not at the rather top edge of developing software, these are usually not always the people that have the critical ability to check whether code is correct. So if something like ChatGPT produces code, how do you check that it's correct? I personally wouldn't want to do that either, because to be honest, if I have a code snippet that does something, I'd rather develop it myself, because I understand exactly why I do it, how does it fit together, rather than have some machine produce some code and now I have to check it's correct. Okay, I can run test cases. That's one way to do it. That's one way, but I prefer actually to have it written so I know that it is essentially the core cases, it's correct. That it doesn't fail in weird cases where there are assumptions that are unacceptable. That being said, of course, much code is just experience, but again, the same story, right? If you write all kinds of exceptions in your code, these exceptions come through a context in which this code is used. There's no reason to assume that ChatGPT can pick that up. ChatGPT cannot pick up that, okay, there's a race condition here, and therefore this code needs to be executed before this parallel code. And well, you need somebody who understands what's going on. And
it's not going to be like modeling, like, am I on a path that leads to technical debt that I'll have to pay back in the future in some way, or like.
Exactly.
So that long range dependency of that, not tracking that will be its limitation.
That will be a limitation for quite a while, I think. It is not unsurmountable. We understood enough that AI has done huge steps forward, but I do think that this is kind of means that everybody who's not on the level that they can do that critically, their job is in danger. if you can do that, if you can evaluate it critically, you can make sure that all these things are happening. I understand the consequence of writing code this way and not that way. But these are high-level developers. These are really the capable guys and gals who basically are able to see, okay, here's going here. If I do this way, these are the long-term consequences, ramifications of what I'm doing. And this is how this code fits into the overall context. That is knowledge that is these long-term contexts is something I feel is not yet solved satisfactorily. Although I'm quite impressed already on the language level how well ChatGPT is able to do that already. That is quite impressive. But I don't think it understands what it's doing, right? Nobody claims it does. And so at some point today, probably we should talk about understanding, but we can explore other topics first. I do think the
understanding is so you're mentioning like blue collar jobs. Is it like a physical, a rich and robust physical causal understanding? For instance, like, but not just physical causal, but even a gentle causal. So it's like, let's say you're building a house, you're going to want to have models like, how is this house going to be used? And it's like multiple steps, and like you're going to know like what actually is dangerous or not. And so like, is that, but I guess what I'm wondering is like in terms of like the bottlenecks that, so what's like, what are the hard things that like would take something like that kind of construction job, or the hard things that would like, so the coder who is keeping track of this multi-step sequencing and how things are hanging together overall, are these largely overlapping as like a bottleneck on performance, or are they actually fairly different classes of problems?
It's a very interesting question. Let's mix up the, or rather decompose it a little bit orthogonally. So brought up two things. Use. Okay, use is one thing, no question about that. That's very important. Humans have an idea of what they want to do with that. But you see, why is software engineer paid much better than a programmer? The reason is very simple. What a software engineer does, a good one, is the things are difficult to explain in software engineering in a way, because they look vague, but what they actually are, they're coarsening of what you do to a level that when you fill it with meaning, if you fill it with actual code that does stuff, it will be robust. It will not break. So it's very easy to write diagrams how this and this and this and this communicates. But of course, as long as you don't have any money in the game, you can do diagrams whatever you want, right? Once you start organizing your code, your data, and how things fit together, you start seeing where the complexity arises. And there is this old joke of my former professor who did software engineering, and it says, well, it's a good software engineer is somebody who's has been working on several failed projects, because you need to see the failure modes in software engineering. They're not trivial. It's not like, okay, I wrote the wrong sign or the wrong letter. They are failure modes that you make an interface too complicated. It's correct. It's also might be even orthogonal, but it's so incredibly complex that it becomes unusable unless you have a whole army of people who are ready to learn that interface and become proficient at that interface, and then are ready to communicate through this interface. So an example is, of course, X Windows. X Windows is this Windows system of Unix, and it's a fantastically designed system. They basically invented object orientation for C long before C++ existed. Absolutely brilliant. it's very clunky if you look at it, because everything had to be worked around through an interface that's actually not object-oriented at all. And when you work with that, I had this layer and this layer and this layer and this dependence, this, it was super general, super orthogonal. But ultimately, very few people wanted to work with it and on the pure level. I have done that at some point, and I really enjoyed it. I felt, you know, there's a full power of the machine. But the next step, you want an interface that's easier to use, that's more compact, that's more that is easier. And so there was this intermediate interface called Motive, which I also did for a while. And later there were better toolkits like Qt or FLTK, simpler toolkits that simplified your life considerably. They did the same things. They probably even reduced your power. There were probably fewer things you could actually do, but they organized how you did things in a way that made it orthogonal, that made it easy to understand, that didn't force you to do things in a particular way, or you could actually concentrate on the actual things you want to pay attention to, rather than every time building a whole scaffold of stuff so that you could make your basic operations. And today you have these kits where you just click a little bit and you can make a decent user interface with very little effort. So people understood this is what you really need. This is, well, in principle you need it, but actually you don't. So you don't do it. So in terms of cleanliness, they're probably less clean in terms of purity, but they're actually what you want. And these things are things that we learn only on long term, I think. That's why technology, for example, sometimes can be stuck on really bad interfaces before it learns to do better. Yeah, there are things that people could have invented much earlier and they didn't, because they didn't realize that this is a concept that would be useful. Simple example, very simple example. Think of Bayesian networks. Bayesian networks is a classic example of something that could easily have invented at the beginning of the 20th century, easily, right? There's nothing there that requires any advanced mathematical methodologies. And yet it was only essentially defined in the 80s properly, which may have held back a lot of ideas in early cybernetics. Early cybernetics has a lot of right ideas how to use information theory, for example, for agents. And it didn't do that, in my opinion, mainly because they didn't have the toolbox, the right way of expressing these ideas. And there's nothing complicated about that. It's just an idea about how to organize your thinking. There are many other examples. I mean, writing is a classic, right? So there are many writing systems that have been developed independently in the world. The Mayas, the Chinese, the lettering, the Phoenician system. But ultimately, the Phoenician system won out. That Phoenician system was the one that basically came to dominate most of the world, directly and indirectly, because it was so much simpler and orthogonal. The Chinese, because it was a large culture, they of course had their system and it influenced the areas around them. So the Tanguts, for example, developed a writing system that was essentially completely different letters from the Chinese, but the principle was the same. So symbolic letters that where Chinese people can't read Tangut script, but if you're an uninitiated, you look at it, you think it's Chinese for non-reader. So in other words, you have these different concepts of how to organize knowledge and action. And somebody comes around and says, well, there's this way of simplifying it. And suddenly it is a complete game changer. And then that is something that can take a long time to discover. So why I'm saying that is this is in the small version, the job of a software engineer, if a good one, on a small scale.
Is the ability to derive conceptual abstractions that could afford the kind of flexibility and I guess moving between frames, like, is that so? Is that what understanding is? So, like, what would you say understanding? What would count as understanding?
Okay, you want to force the issue. Okay, good. Then I'll follow you. Oh no, let's keep it as a cliffhanger. I will talk about that. I've put it in my agenda for today, but let's keep it as a cliffhanger. Come back to it. We tease it on. I'm almost doing like these series that keep you watching, so that you wait for when will this thread resolve. The reason I'm talking about that is because there are this higher level skills of organization. The further away you go, the less obvious it is what consequences there are to your decision, and it's less immediate, and it's less, how to say, the technical debt builds up at different spots of a pipeline. And of course, the classic examples for well-designed interfaces, for example, is things like, if you think of Unix, I mean, would you have imagined somebody that Koenig and Ritchie, whatever, invented Unix in the 70s? They would have thought this is going to be the main operating system, except for one other major commercial operating system. That was not really clear. I mean, when many operating systems, was one operating system which was
I might have lost you. So the last thing I heard is one operating system that was, and now you're silent.
interesting.
Testing. We'll get you back in 10 seconds.
Which had a very good security system, for example.
So the last thing I heard was one operating system. And then you went, now you're back.
Okay. So
the last thing I heard was one operating system. But then everything that followed, so he wasn't aware at first, would this be, like, except for one commercial offering, basically the predominant operating system that people use?
Yes, I mean, Unix is quite amazing that obviously it's orthogonal enough and basic enough to support long-term stability. And it's in fact so stable that we can assume that it's probably going to stay around for a while. Maybe people will put intermediate layers, but Unix itself is probably going to stay more or less. There are a couple of flavors of Unix, but not many. And there was another operating system called Multics. Few people will know that. But Multics was, as you can imagine, Unix was actually simplification of Multics, as the name already says. Multics had a very clever security concept, far more elaborate than Unix. So it turned out that the simplification actually survived. Multics did not. It was a very good operating system, but it was clearly far ahead of its time. And there's no, I don't think we'll go back to that at some point. People will not do a retrofitting of Multics. There are other things like that. Like if you look at Lisp as language, it's very old, 60s, early 60s. It's an amazingly clever, well-designed language.
Is that like the list structured language where it's like lists of lists of lists?
Yes. Now, it is super powerful, super flexible. And many of the modern languages essentially start copying it in a way, including, for example, if you look at Julia, as a friend of mine says, Well, it's almost Lisp with a nicer syntax in terms of what it offers, what you can do with it, and very fast, very powerful. And you see that certain things just keep surviving. Yeah, it's not just the syntax has changed, but the concepts they have remained quite similar in this thing. So what I'm saying is that once there are certain types of designs that are so successful that they become almost the ground truth for everything that comes after. Think of DNA. DNA is something like that. It's going to stay, right? I mean, life has discovered DNA as a model to transform information, to conserve code, and it's not going to change a lot. Yeah, there may be minor, minor adjustments, but nothing major is going to change in life unless we move into a silicon-based life form. Silicon, not in terms of chemistry, but in terms of organization of information.
Initial search period, maybe even there was a brief period where like we flirted with something more like Multics, not Unix. What was it?
Yes. There are some indications that the code was not. I mean, Goldenberg and Bose did actually investigate that. They might just be the winners of a coding competition, if you like.
But then there's a winner, and it had like it had a good enough balance of like stability and plasticity that you could get like cumulative structure with variation, not so much that you lose it all, but you know, from generation to generation, but not so little that you don't have the primary repertoire of diversity to draw from to find new forms.
Exactly.
And so then now everything assumes it. And so, you know, in theory, maybe there is like a setup that is better than DNA, but no, where that's.
Yeah. That's a ground substrate now, right? Yeah. Rewriting that is non-trivial, right? I mean, there is this question: can you replace photosynthesis, natural photosynthesis, by more efficient processes? Maybe there's an engineering way to do that nature cannot find, or cannot get to, or has not found. But the point is, in nature, this will not happen on its own. You need human engineering stepping out of the system to some extent to be able to cross that bridge.
Stepping out of the system.
Yes. Right. So we look at this. We look at these things and we realize that it's sometimes difficult to see ahead of time that this is a really good choice of a ground substrate. I want to take another example, which I find very instructive, and that is, of course, the template system of C++. Right? It's a very technical argument, but I'm aware that the syntax is not very nice, and it's a very clunky, but the concept itself is very clever. In fact, it's so clever that it's really striking that you can actually abuse it. In C++ 11, it has been made more simple, but even the older system, you could abuse it to make arithmetics on the template level. So basically, compiler computes what you need to compute. I remember that I was so fascinated by the fact that you could actually, purely in the compilation process, write code that would find out whether a number is a prime number. And it would actually look like the implementation of the Peano axioms to some extent. You basically would implement the Peano axioms in a very clunky way, but it was powerful enough to do that. And people discovered that. I don't know. I mean, Strausstrup is a brilliant guy, but I still don't. I would find it difficult to imagine that is what he had in mind. He had in mind a system that's well designed, works orthogonally. You can do meta programming to some extent. And it had to be consistent. He had a good feeling, a good intuition for how to make the system consistent. And lo and behold, it was so consistent that you could actually do the full arithmetics for that.
Meta programming, you mentioned.
Meta programming. Yeah. So I do think that when that came out, I mean, the whole Boost library, the fact that you can write something like the Boost library, which is quite an impressive feat. It's very, very impressive piece of engineering.
Like boost the next shape, like the ensemble learning method for boosting or something different?
No, sorry, I should have said it. No, there's a library called Boost for C++.
Okay.
That's a collection of algorithms, and some of them are very, very brilliantly put together. They basically worked around the limitations and the quirks of C++ to make very, very nicely designed toolkits. You see, I kind of like C++ in a almost masochistic way, because you don't expect that this is possible with this language, but it permits this. It has these capabilities which almost are emergent. I mean, I'm careful with this word because I know this word is overloaded, multiply overloaded, but it's almost emergent that you can do these things. And so people do these things and pack them together, and suddenly you have this ecosystem that works. And that's why C++ is just not going to go away so quickly.
Is there a connection between metaprogramming and stepping out of the system in terms of what's required? Or,
well, to some extent, of course it is, right? I mean, you talk about programming. Metaprogramming is programs about programs. That is not really surprising, okay? You essentially write programs that, I wouldn't say reason about programs, but they compute what programs to produce. Now, the problem with that is, this is very old, right? Lisp was able to do that. The problem is you do that, and in an uncontrolled fashion, it doesn't work, right? Stuff just keeps breaking because you can't actually keep that stable. You have to understand what you're doing. And if you just evolve it, right, genetic programming tries to do that, to evolve these things. And it's not trivial, because there is something that the human brain does that is difficult to capture in programming. I'll explain what I mean. Imagine I give you a Python program, and I tell you, convert this Python program into, say, C or Java. That doesn't really matter, but let's say C. I prefer C because it's a little bit closer to the metal. And you will transform it into a C program. You will understand the semantics, what does a Python program do, and you can transform it into C. Now, of course, you could also take a converter that takes essentially the Python code and transforms it into runnable C code. It will basically put all the pointers, create all the memory allocations, do all the things. You look at this code, is ununderstandable. You cannot understand this code, right? It will be a clunky, much messier business than the C code that you rewrite as a human. Now, an engineer would say, yes, but this C code that is directly converted from Python will be a faithful reproduction of what the Python code is doing, including error messages, including this, including that. Well, yes, it may be, but in most cases, that's not what you want. What you want is a transfer of the semantics into the C code and becoming C code, not Python code that just can be compiled by a C compiler, which is not the same thing. You want the Python code be a more or less equivalent C code, where the errors are treated like in C, not like in Python, for example. So what happens in our brain? We give up on precision to some extent to achieve conceptual faithfulness of a concept. That's why, for example, when you might do a mathematical proof, how do people make mathematical proofs? They are not compilers. They don't generate all the possible solutions and try to prove it. In fact, this is something that really people don't like to do. There are proofs that you can do case 1, case 2, case 3, case 4. You could do that. And people don't like proofs like that. They prefer a proof where, okay, I have this closed expression for this thing, and then I can just derive the formula. POC. That's what they prefer. Or I understand, I want the series to actually converge to that point. I have a feeling for what it does geometrically or topologically, or how it behaves. And now I have to find a formalism that actually captures this behavior properly. So what we have is, and here comes again, an understanding of what we want that is not necessarily isomorphic to what ultimately happens on the ground. There's something else going on. There's some reduction of knowledge, some coarsening of knowledge that, however, guides you in the right direction. That if you are only permitting perfectly correct deductions, you will have a hard time of finding. And it also will not give you insight. If I give you this Python program, convert it into C, and tell you, what does this program do? You look at it, I have no idea. I give you the same C program, a couple of lines, you say, oh, yeah, that's a C of Aristophanes, or that is a Euclidean algorithm, or there's something, you understand what it's doing. Not always, but the chances are much higher. Because when a human writes it, who knows what they're doing, chances are you will understand what's happening there.
This coarse-grained, I don't know if it would be an abstraction layer, but this coarse graining, I keep going back and forth between wondering, like, to what degree, actually, with maybe these things I'm about to say, maybe even being one and the same in a sense, but like some like abstract logic that can be applied across domains, or something actually the abstraction is very concrete, almost like I'm thinking of like George Lakoff's like primary metaphors ideas, where like this idea of like you're actually drawing on some like embodied experiences to even like bootstrap some concepts in mathematics. They're actually like notions like containment, like certain like even like set theoretic notions, or continuity along the line, like, and you've expressed things like this before, like the unit, like almost like an anthropics, like the fact that we could even say some things implies some things about the world, like the fact that we can do mathematics actually constrains what kind of world we live in. And so I guess what I'm wondering is there like almost like a lingua franca, I don't know if it's abstraction layer, but like when we're doing this like coarse graining that lets us step out of the system, like kind of coming back to the blue collar worker, the autonomous house builder, and the skilled programmer, like, is there like an abstraction over things that are initially basically our experiences as embodied beings in the world, like encountering obstacles, moving around them, that like gives us some of these abilities, but we're doing it in like an abstract domain. So it's like I encounter this, I have a general sense of like, okay, so here's a thing that's going to obstruct me, and then I know move around like at a different point of view. Like there's like is there a is there a what is the nature of this coarse graining, like, or the natures? Is it a single one? Like, do we have like a library of modes? Do we have like?
I think that's exactly the point, right? So let's start with the first statement and then with the second. First statement is then lingua franca. Well, some people actually think that proving is a bit like navigation. It would be really interesting to find out whether it's true. Not sure. But why not? I mean, I do actually believe that it's the opposite of obstacles. So I think the way we think, unlike machines, that we think that first in terms of the obstacles not being there, and the obstacles then are force us to fine-tune, while the machine works from the outset with the obstacles and has then various selection algorithms to remove the solutions that ignore the existence of obstacles. So I would say that humans work exactly the other way around. Humans assume, oh yeah, I can capture the queen, I can capture the king, I can break through this line, I can get to the center.
I'll improvise as I go, but for artificial systems as we do them now, you'll have like a bunch of exception handlers and you have to say what are the likely obstacles that you'll encounter. You have to call the, you have to like identify them in advance. Is that
Yes,
or
for machines. And machines basically never try to imagine what would the world look like without the obstacle. I have always this joke that I say, what's the first human? And there's my definition of the first human was the ape that pointed to the moon and said, I want to go there, or I want this. It's basically saying something that's impossible, but ignoring that as possible and thinking of it as something that's feasible, as an action that might be possible in some way. Ignoring the fact that you
making
can
progress
right
in that
now not do
direction,
it.
you have no assurance that it will halt or find any solution you want that will be workable, but there's a little kind of like a, you start thinking into this possibility, like, how could I fly? And you have no idea
Yes.
if you'll ever find the solution, but you begin this search process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The way, I mean, if you look at people with jetpacks or with wingsuits, I mean, seriously, they're seriously close to what Superman is doing. We're not talking about turning the earth around and stuff like that, but this is really, people imagine Superman is flying, and now these people do that. That is, I think this is probably the most human, the thing that probably makes us stand out most from any other animal, probably more than anything else. Now, I don't know whether anybody studied that, and I think that would be an interesting study, whether apes are able to imagine things that are, you know, as if the obstacles don't exist. We know they're very intelligent. We know that they can think theory mind. Many birds can do that and so on. But the question is, can they imagine something that's really not doable, but in principle, we could imagine that it could be done if there were not certain things that keep us from doing it. Maybe you need language for that. Don't know. Or imagination, they would have imagination. The question is at which level. So in short, that's the first thing I would say to look at. Second thing is, and now you say, is a one or is a many? I think you put the finger directly on the wound. I do think understanding means many overlapping cause and links. So if you look at understanding, what does understanding mean? In my opinion, you see something, learn something, and you learn addition. That's cool. You know how to add numbers. Good. Learn how to add numbers. Okay. With time, you learn that, okay, addition and multiplication are linked, and then there's a link via logarithm. So multiplication can be turned into addition when you use logarithm. Another view of addition. And you learn about commutativity. You learn about groups. You learn about the invention of the zero. I say an invention. It's not discovery. It's more than discovery. It's an invention. Then the invention of the negative numbers, or discovery. With the negative numbers, I'm not anymore sure that it's an invention anymore, once that zero has been identified. And suddenly, you get all these extra views what addition is. Addition is a vector space, and then it's not just a vector space. A vector space is a special case of, you know, more general object like topological or set, algebras, topological space, and all these things that interact. And suddenly, if you look at the Rn, that thing is everything, right? It has all these properties. You can look at the topological space as a Lie group, as a vector space, as an affine space, as a special manifold, and so on. In other words, you start seeing all these different facets, and that is, in my opinion, understanding. So it is basically different. I'll use a word that Christopher Nahaner likes to use, is a different coordinate systems through which you can not only look at the system, but actually travel through the system. And in my opinion, the more of these you have, the better your understanding. So understanding is not a 0-1 condition. Yeah, the understanding to the first level, I would say you can travel somehow through the system. But good understanding means you have multiple ways of traveling through the system, and that may never stop. Your understanding of something can become better and better and better, unless you have a way to prove that there is no further structured way of looking at it. If you look at the integers, positive integers, for example, you say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It doesn't look very interesting, right? It's, you know, you count. And then you discover that there are prime numbers, and suddenly it gets much more interesting. And they find all this extra structure and find the rational numbers. And suddenly all this really, really complex and rich additional structure emerges. And the more of these you have, the better your understanding is. That would be my definition.
So in a way, we're back to navigation, and understanding is, in this view, having multiple routes to a target that you can work with depending on, and have some idea, and that you can select from based on what's best fit for the current job. But so, and you can have, but it's also not just, from what you're saying, not just multiple routes where each facet is a trajectory you can take, but there's a certain, like, even potential compositionality of these routes where you can switch between them and build upon them. And so that
not just
really powerful flexible pathfinding.
It's not just the routes itself, it's really the system of routes you use. It's basically like, so you know not just the subway, you also know the bus system, you know the tram system, the train system. It's a stupid example, I'm sorry, because it's really completely different ways of traveling through the system. And not just traveling, you understand how the system actually operates in completely different ways, with different filters that you put on your eyes and say, okay, here I'm navigating by going straight, here I'm navigating by turning around, here I'm navigating completely differently. There are different ways of doing similar things. And understanding means you have a picture of these, and good understanding means you can switch between these seamlessly.
A picture within a reference frame or a coordinate system, a particular coordinate system or reference frame associated with each of these facets as modes of understanding. And then like robust understanding is this ability to be able to adaptively switch between these different
or maintain them at the same time, perhaps even. I mean, the best example, in my opinion, for this is things like listening to a fuga of Bach, for example. I'm not just saying that to name drop. I mean, people always say Bach is kind of this type of almost metaphysical experience. I'm really meaning it in a very concrete sense. When you have a fuga of Bach with 4 or 5 voices, and you can follow each of them, and you can see how they work together. And a beginner hears 1 voice, a little bit more you hear 2, but still you hear these separately or in together. But brilliant artists, like, I mean, Glenn Gould is a classic, of course, but brilliant artists don't just hear them together, they know how they work together, how they switch. The attention system essentially is able to capture more than just one dimension of that. It is able to capture multiple intakes from the multiple layers or multiple coordinate systems at the same time. I think that's what understanding is. And I do feel that people like, for example, Tononi, who look at IIT, I think that's implicit to what they do is perhaps the quest to have these multiple levels of things that interact, but do different stuff, but still have to work together at the same time. And so what they want to quantify is this mixture of interference and independence of these different layers. That would be a very, qualitative interpretation of what they may be looking for. Maybe not, but this would be my interpretation. If I were to work on IIT, that would be something I would try to look at.
I think they might be beginning to move there with IIT 4.0. I know they're starting to move into category theory to try to get basically more of an emphasis on relations.
Okay.
Relations of relations and try to upgrade the formalism. I don't know how far they got there with 4.0, but that's been an effort. I think along the lines you're saying, like they've been trying over the past few years. I don't know how, I can't evaluate, I don't know how far they got, but I do believe that is actually like one of the primary interests for where they want to head. This is probably a tangent, but you, I think you might be a friend of yours. This person wrote about like morphological computation.
I lost you. Can you just repeat this?
He might be a friend of yours. He wrote about morphological computation and zombies in IIT. And this idea is like more of the, oh, you still can't hear me.
I hear you now, but I missed the person you were talking about.
Oh, I don't know who it is. It might be a friend of yours. So he Nihat, maybe not. So he wrote,
Nihat,
yeah.
Yes.
And like this like shifting of like where different forms of integration are occurring based on whether you're like offloading your intelligence onto the environment or not. I think this is probably a tangent. It does it's an interesting line of work.
I mean, the Kevin O'Regan has been trying to interpret consciousness in the context of an environment, in the context of this interaction with the environment. I really don't think it's in the environment, right? It can't be. No, but let's put it this way. Plausibly, I don't think it makes sense to attribute any consciousness above an absolute minimal epsilon to an inanimate object. Maybe there's a kind of epsilon, if you measure it, if there's a measure, maybe there's some kind of epsilon quantity to do it, but no more than that. You really need a living organism for this. But I kind of see what he might require, right? He might require, okay, this is the organism and it has to interact with something, and there's a word around it. And only in the interaction with the world, this organism can form consciousness. But it's still in the organism. End of story. It must be there. Consciousness is a very difficult topic. I think we discussed that before, and I actually don't want too much to enter this one again, except for when we talk about this understanding. Maybe the ability to have multiple of these coordinate systems running at the same time. And here, again, we enter the IIT type thinking, is actually essential for consciousness. If I'm completely in the flow and I'm single-mindedly doing one thing and do it very well, and only that, is my consciousness on a very high level? Not necessarily. I do it very well. I do things, I may even enjoy it. But unless I activate multiple modes of attention, I don't think the consciousness is very high, because if I'm very reactive and so on, I may be actually daydreaming or not thinking of anything else, almost mechanical. I'm not sure that this counts as consciousness. So I would actually say this link of the process where you say, oh, I have to run all these attentional tracks at the same time, and I run them on the same time. That may be an element of consciousness. I don't know. I am speculating here very wildly and with no guarantee.
It's along the lines of where the nascent intuitions were going for me, because like if I'm remembering, so like, and I think Giulio like supported this idea that like there would be as you are engaging in more morphological computation, relying more on that and like offloading the intelligence onto the environment or the challenge, the idea I think was that whether we call it consciousness or not, but like the interesting emergence and the work that needs to be done. The idea was that like under those states, according to IIT, where the interesting entanglements are being pushed out of the system, you might be less conscious. And then I guess the other connection I'm wondering is like this, and I think we're mixing senses of consciousness, but that's all right for now. But this like kind of like Heideggerian phenomenology where it's like you're immersed in the world in a largely unreflexive state with minimal awareness needed in a state of just effortless mastery. So like you're hammering and the hammer is ready, you know, it's ready to hand, and then you hit your thumb, present at hand, and now this onerous and expensive thing, you know, you come to it. So I guess what I'm wondering is like in terms of this, so if you're having like, so if there's like I don't know if it's subsumption framing where it's like some sort of hierarchy, as you move upwards, your potential to be able to move between different like strings of the melody. So it's like if the interesting entanglements and like you're in,
yes,
yes,
the ability to move between them and possibly create even other structures and see these other structures at the same time. There's actually a very nice example that I just recently viewed on YouTube. It was an analysis of the fugato at the end of the Jupiter Symphony of Mozart, which is an amazing, I'm aware of the complexity of the piece, but sometimes actually talking about that and picking out why it's so amazing, it's actually, that's why this piece is so great. I think the video is called the best 30 seconds in the music of Mozart or something like that. And you know, Mozart is pretty amazing anyway, but I used to underestimate him. When I was a kid, I actually didn't like him, although everybody says like kids music, but I actually didn't like it because it was, and then when I started playing him, I started appreciating the music far more. That was a real, you know, eye opener. You suddenly understand, no, it looks simple. It's not. Because you suddenly see all these undertones, underflows, things that happen in between and how things have to be fit together to work. When it works, right, you never ask a question. You never wonder why it works. But when you have to put it together, you suddenly, oh, this works and this works and this works together and that works together. Then suddenly that where you get understanding. If you look at number systems, the old number systems that the Romans use, is clunky, it's horrible, absolutely disgusting, right? It's completely useless. Well, not useless, but clearly you can't do good math with that, right? So every time things were simplified, progress was made. Once you simplify notation, it is the classic point. When you simplify notation, that's probably the most important step for the development of a new technique. Simplifying notation, simplifying handling, tools.
the most important.
Probably the most important. It's not the only one. Proving theorems is important, but notions, good notation, that's a game changer. There's a good reason why notation matters, right? Notation is not just and because it makes it simpler to put all these threads together. Therefore, it improves understanding. If you look at the time of Einstein, if you look at general relativity, there's this old joke where Eddington was asked that by the reporter, and I don't know whether it's true, it doesn't matter whether it's true, it's just a good story. It was asked, I heard there are only 3 people who understand Einstein's general relativity. And Eddington famously was supposed to say, I'm wondering who the 3rd one is, right? So today, this is something you learn in physics in the 2nd or 3rd year. So we have simplified and streamlined the way to communicate this technology, this technique, to a level that you can, with reasonable topical competence, teach it to anybody. So I think that that is the hidden heroes of science and technology are the tools, annotation, and notions. These are the hidden heroes of scientific development.
Rules, notation, and notions.
Yes. Yeah, you simplify things, you identify what's important, what's not so important. If you look at how they did linear algebra in the 19th century, it's horrible. I remember going to a library where they had these really old books, and I was still, I think, either at school or early or undergrad or something, and they got these books out of the library. It's fantastic, these huge books, you know, put them on the table, and you feel like this old scholar, where I turn the pages and the musty smell of a book that has been standing there and was waiting for somebody to open it. And then you see all this text with lots of matrices and diagrams, and you think, wow, that's hard to understand. That is really, you know, and today you don't do that. I mean, most of linear algebra in the 19th century was based on determinants. Nobody does that anymore. Determinants have a very little corner in the whole space of linear algebra. Sometimes you use them, sometimes it's unavoidable, but most of the time you don't want them. Most of the time you really don't want them.
I have seen farther than others. It's because I have stood on the shoulders of giants that I have compressed into efficient pointers that I can move between efficient. If I've compressed the giants. I've compressed the titans, or they helped compress themselves.
I would actually say
I could check rather than derive,
because I used the giants glasses, right? So this is it, not because they stood on the shoulders of them, but because they used their glasses. The giants are the ones who find a good way. I mean, it's not the only thing, right?
Filters, their coordinate systems, their coarse grainings.
Their coarse grainings, their coordinate systems.
Those tools, then organized by that notational scheme.
And that is, in my opinion, the big issue when we talk about understanding. So some people say, oh, it's okay if we don't understand what neural networks are doing. It's okay for certain things, but it's not okay for others, because who does the introspection? I'm not even talking about danger here, or talking about risk aversion. I'm just talking who does the introspection in these networks. Nobody. That's exactly why they want explainable AI. What is explainable AI? It's exactly what we're talking about in the ideal case, right? In the less ideal case, it's a bit like expert systems, right? Expert systems used to be a concept that people tried to espouse in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, where you would interrogate experts and ask them for hours, and try to put that in a rule-based system. It was an interesting idea, but it completely failed. It didn't work. Because experts are not very good at introspection. They don't see why they do certain stuff. Now, neural networks are not good at introspection either. So, but at least you show them examples and learn. That's what you do. But you can also not always abstract things away. And these are the irreducible complexities of simply learning the manifold, learning exactly where each prediction happens. But sometimes you can generalize. That's exactly what's the job of science is. Finding out, if you do modern medicine is surprisingly successful because people started to do molecular medicine. You identify which molecules have which job, which type of metabolic pathways disrupted. This is very mechanistic, but it's also saying this is what happens if I understand this part of the system. and then say, okay, if I can disrupt this path or a similar path, I have a drug that is medically promising.
It's like for an expert system, I don't know the different approaches. So I guess some people like, did they want to use Bayesian networks? It seems like you could maybe try to encode knowledge that way. I guess I know of like, is anyone combining like the psych project with mass language models? Because that was like one attempt for like, I guess not an expert system, but like this evoking from human experts all the things we know and us as experts to.
I don't think that it's so easy, because the problem is very few experts, or the skill of being an expert and the skill of explaining your expertise, teaching your expertise, are quite different skills. So we see that very well in football players. So you have people who are very good football players and not very effective coaches. People who are great coaches, but not brilliant football players. You're people who are both. This is not the same skill. It's just not, it just isn't. Okay. And also it's not always clear what is the dimension along which I should decompose my knowledge. Because if you see, there's something interesting about, I find that very interesting. Football teams right now, there are major upheavals in the German league, and you see that there are coaches that are very good in one team, but they don't succeed in another team. You go to another team and they don't succeed, and you think, is it a bad coach? Probably not. This coach was very successful in one team, then it failed in another team. So there are multiple things that can change here. One thing is that is a bit like a bull and bear market. So basically where the fashion of strategies changes overall. So the coach was very good at a particular phase of a particular type of strategies, but once the strategies shifted to a different style of strategies, they are no longer on top of the curve. I don't think this is so much the case anymore in modern football, say, for example, for the very simple reason, because especially in the top leagues of Europe, say, they are so competitive that you can't afford to sit in a say, fashionable niche. You really
need Queensland. It's they're fairly well matched, and you have to train as hard as you can just to maintain your like. You keep resting your past laurels of what you were doing. Like people are trying to find exploits of whatever you're doing to beat you, and they're very good. And so
all the time.
So they're evolving. You have to be evolving too.
Absolutely. So, but there's another thing that you get out of sync with yourself. So there are these cases where everything just runs fine, right? You're in flow, and the coach and the team and everything works together, and suddenly something comes out of sync, which can happen. Another question is how to get back in sync. That is actually a very interesting thing. All top performing artists, sportsmen, probably politicians, probably scientists, know how to put themselves back in sync when they are out. Because sync, I mean synchronization. Because this happens. It happens that it doesn't work. You have even these great movie makers that make movies, and all the movies succeed, and suddenly they don't succeid anymore. What is it? Have they become, incapable? Sometimes it's health issues. Sometimes it's something else, life crisis. But in some cases, they just have lost the. If it's not just a change of fashion, which also can be the case, but sometimes it's just that they don't get their own skill, their own skills out of sync with what I'm trying to do. And then basically what I have to basically reset the synchronization again. And when they do, then they suddenly, I have a second wind, and suddenly it works again. And suddenly
wait for a couple months or a year and do something completely different, and then and then come back again with fresh eyes.
Exactly, because the talent is still there, right? So I'm talking about people where the talent is not just broken or gone, or motivation is gone. It's just where something just doesn't work anymore, and they basically have to find again how to redo it. I mean, a guy like Picasso, for example, he was famous for disrupting his style multiple times, probably on purpose, to force himself to, when he loses one, he captures another one, captures another train. I think that's also a way to do that. And there are people who, they call it reinventing themselves, right? When people reinvent themselves, I think that's what they do. They accept, okay, we get out of sync. Okay, let's pick a different wavelength. Let's pick a different rhythm of doing things, which is perfectly fine. And in fact, it's actually, I forgot where I got that from. Unfortunately, I find it hard to reconstruct, but there was some, I think, study that showed that people who keep being creative for a long time over their life are people who keep changing topics every few years.
Is this potentially part of the functional significance of dreaming, as like basically you're training yourself up under like a high temperature conditions where like basically keeping you from getting stuck later, like maintaining your ability, like you said, like, so like this Picasso example, like you said, like he was constantly like interrupting himself to like, and so like, and so like he was able to maintain a certain generativity, a creative genius throughout his life, partially because of this kind of training. I guess I'm wondering, like, is that part of what dreams do for us?
Well, people try to interpret it like that, right? So to be honest, it's very hard to say, right? Because nobody knows whether dreams are just a post hoc emergent process, or they always existed, or do lizards dream? I would probably assume they do. So it might be that it's just consolidation of knowledge. Consolidation of knowledge means zooming in and out, and probably that's what the dream does. It zooms in and out of what you know, what you don't know. It simulates stuff. And I do think that, for example, there's this question of there's this thing of PTSD, which is considered a problem, but in my opinion, it's just the overexpression of something very valuable. Namely, you had emotionally charged events in your life, and the emotion tells you this is important.
Important
now,
replay.
And you replay it. You train on the replay. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, unfortunately, you have relatively few samples. So that may create overtraining. In my opinion, that's what PTSD is, simply overtraining on this case. It's not that it's useless, it's actually very important, but you can't get out of it because you have only one case like that. And that affects you. If you have multiple cases, it may still create PTSD, or you have, okay, it averages out. We don't know, right? I mean, this is all hypothetical. I'm not a psychologist, but I would say that this is kind of the counterpart. Dreaming is opposite, where the general knowledge is being accumulated and then incorporated in what's there.
It does seem to be like whenever we have like some sort of not whenever, but oftentimes when there's some sort of like pathological state, it's so often, and it's common, it seems like it's oftentimes the other side of something essential. And it's just like, and so it's like in this case, so this is PTSD, like it's crippling for people, but so what's the essential thing? It's the ability to prioritize important information for basically offline learning and planning. And but in this case, if that important sampling creates is now feeding back on what you find to be important in this like in a self-perpetuating basically an autopoietic system, now you got trouble.
Yeah, you basically create a resonance loop that's not supposed to be there.
You might want some resonance loop just to like give you enough stability for learning the new thing, but like if that keeps going forever, that's
yes, if that hogs your attention, if that hogs your executive loop, then you are in trouble. That's exactly the problem. And I do think generally we should look at these things as expressions of something sensible to an insensible extent, rather than saying, oh, this is just pathology. So in many illnesses, not all of them, of course, but many illnesses have a source of, well, there is some reason why this illness is actually occurring. There's something else it was supposed to be an answer for. If I'm not talking about parasites. Parasites is a separate issue, because parasites are essentially an external agent with external agendas. But if it's an illness, self-generated illness, it's usually something that was supposed to have a role and took it a bit too seriously. It's like bureaucracy going wild. You know, there's this crippling bureaucracies and big corporations where suddenly the bureaucracy becomes all-consuming, and you think to yourself, okay, there was a reason for it at the point, but it became self-perpetuating.
This seems critical for, I mean, like, at least clinically, it seems like it would be, because and in general, for any attempt to change, like, unless you like acknowledge the essential thing, if you go in trying to change it without acknowledging the essential thing, one, you might actually cause harm, because there might have been an essential thing. And even if you don't cause harm in that dimension, unless you acknowledge the essential thing, you'll probably get resistance. And like, rightly so, like and I guess another part also could be even, it seems like that frame helps with avoiding like excessive like stigma, and like basically it gives you, and basically like criticizing yourself, you know, so you don't have the strength to change. So like it would be like keeping in mind like what is being served here, and what are those adaptive functions. That seems invaluable to me.
Yes, I think, in my opinion, I mean, I know that
For really any system, it seems you want to change.
Right.
For any complex system, we might want to change.
Yeah, exactly. This is a classical complex system issue. Now, I mean, I know that Sigmund Freud is no longer in fashion, but I think that a reason why his theories were so attractive is because I think that's what he picks out. There are reasons for things to happen. I mean, he doesn't formulate it exactly like that, but I think he intuitively understood that there are reasons why things happen. We know much more today, right? We have much better understanding of what's happening today, and we have much better grip on certain things, certain illnesses today. But I do think the general issue in illnesses is understand, especially if it's self-generated, so it's not parasite induced.
Not a rival agent that's just exploiting you, but like it's you adversarially attacking yourself. Are you like,
yes, autoimmune systems, mental health issues, for example, and things like that. That all sometimes it's simply that people put themselves under scrutiny, or the immune system puts itself under scrutiny, which is overdoing. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that. It means that it's just too much, right? And it basically has a lacks of a balance of what it should include and what should not include in consideration. I mean, there's this nice saying, which I find always very funny. The fact that you are paranoid doesn't mean that they're not after you. And that is exactly that, right? So paranoia, thinking, okay, they may be after you, may be a very healthy feeling if you live in a, for example, dictatorial state. It's, you know, it will help you survival. It's less important in a say a liberal democratic state. Again, it depends on the situation, of course, right? And it really means also that you are overloading your attention with self-feeding, self-sustaining, parasitic information waves when that happens. So you basically have self-perpetuating parasitic informational processes that run in your brain if that happens, for example. So the whole point is that you have to starve them. That would be a completely non-clinical interpretation of what happens there in the language of complex systems.
I mean, I think something along those lines is what people are hoping for with psychedelics, in terms of this, like, maybe, you know, starving or annealing those
Yes.
autoimmune, those excessive the loss, basically the rigidity, the loss of the ability to flexibly move between your core screenings, and instead it's just one obligatory view that comes in, and this kind of self-generated nature of it that then fuels back to itself. Like, their common process that people seem to focus on, and I think probably for good reason, is these default mode operations, where it's like the core networks associated with like different, you know, kinds of interoceptive modeling and imaginative planning, those relaxing those, disrupting those, and then providing an opportunity, and so then allowing for new combinations to form again. So,
and that's why technique is so important, right? If you're high performing, whatever it is, scientist, artist, sportsman, sportswoman, really doesn't matter, but technique is giving you a grounding, so it keeps you from running off on a tangent. That is, I think, crucial.
so if you practice with, I guess, more mindfulness of technique, and I guess I'm also coming to mind from last week, thinking of like whether you have like one big room or multiple rooms. Like, I'm wondering, like, what are best practices for avoiding accumulating both that kind of technical debt within yourself, and of a kind that would result in you, if you sometimes you need a vacation, you need to step away. Sometimes you need high dose psychedelics. But what are things you can do to make those times where you need to refactor your code? Like,
yes,
how can you prevent the spaghetti code from accumulating to begin with? Like, what are...
absolutely. If you do that right, then it not only doesn't accumulate so quickly, but sometimes you are very, very lucky. You get what I call a new substrate. So imagine you write this library, and this library is amazingly flexible, and suddenly you start using it everywhere. Perhaps other people start using it. Suddenly the whole thing just becomes fixture. Okay, this is a rare case. It doesn't happen every day, but it does happen, and at different scales. And for this, however, you need to get out of your rut. You need to actively disrupt this rhythm of yourself, especially when you get too comfortable. People say get out of comfort zone. Why? I mean, it's a bit masochistic to do that, right? Why do you get out of your comfort zone? That has two reasons. One reason is that if you're in your comfort zone, it starts shrinking, actually, right? If you live in your comfort zone, the comfort zone starts shrinking because you become more and more, optimizing. You optimize what you do, and you become more and more confined. This is what I know to do really well, and you do it and don't want to do anything else. So that's one problem. So in other words, the robustness goes down, right? The robustness to serious perturbation, not to the small ones that you are used to, but the ones that can get you out of sync. So you become more.
You have the Picasso solution to that, which is train with interrupts, adopt practices that make you do things differently.
Yes, but there's a second reason for that, right? So the one thing is robustness, right? You getting robust, but I think you also train a different part of your brain. So when you learn a skill and you become really good at automatizing it, then this is delegated to a part of the brain a different part of the brain. And for example, I hate doing repetitive stuff. I absolutely detest it. So if I have to do something that's very repetitive, so for example, we have some user interface, and this user interface is super slow. You click and you upload the file, you click, you can't, there's no API, you have to do it manually. So what I do usually is I basically program myself to completely automate what I do. First I do this, then I do this, then I do this, first I do this, then I do this. It becomes automatic. So it's almost like a script running, and my brain shuts down, essentially. I can do that, and it doesn't use up my valuable attention. I don't feel tired after that, or at least not as tired as I would if I would pay attention to each step. I just make it as automatic as I can. However, if you do that on things that you actually have to do all the time, basically all the other parts of your brain stop working. The parts that incorporate new knowledge. That's, by the way, why travel, I think, is so useful. Travel is not useful because it's just, you know, seeing other locations. It's because it forces your brain to do work to incorporate this new knowledge in existing knowledge. You have to fit in these pieces of knowledge that come in old stuff. It's not quite as easy if it's something entirely new. That's what Picasso did. Picasso was much more drastic in a way. It's like saying, okay, let's learn a new language. Let's say I learned Tibetan or Thai or I don't know, Swahili. These are completely different languages now, and it's much harder to do. So it's not as easy as traveling to a new place. That really requires a lot of effort. I can put in this effort, I can learn, but I cannot expect to be, you know, it's not in a training of the incorporation of existing knowledge. It's completely, I open a new door, a new cupboard, I buy a new cupboard, put it in a new location, I have to fill it again from scratch. I think what travel and related topics do very well, they force you to expand your map, a known map, with new material. That's a very specific skill that I think has a lot to do with navigation, in the sense that your map now is actively incorporated, and now you have to find, okay, what from my old coordinate system still works and what doesn't.
Sounds like it might be important to either move every couple of years or do something like spring cleaning, where you really go into your house and like go into all those covers and move things around and place things in different.
That is, it's not that you move, because if you move, you just disrupt things, you know, but you don't gain anything by that, right? And I moved the book from here to here, now I don't know where it is. That's what happens to me, right? When I clear up stuff, where did I put this now, right? If I have this heap on my table, I know the paper is roughly here, right? But if you sort your house, resort it, but if it's a new area where you have no preconceptions where things are, that's fine. That's where you pick up fast. Pick up fast when you go, I don't know, even a hotel room. A hotel room is not a very interesting environment, but still, when you stay there, say for a couple of days. So the first day, I always find it really difficult to sort out, where is this? Where shall I put my stuff? Where this? On the third day, I'm good, right? I know where everything is, and I know my routine, and I'm as fast as I am at home. The process of learning that, it's not very interesting, but there are things that are interesting where you are always at the boundary between known and unknown. That boundary is interesting, where you incorporate the new knowledge into what you know. That's also the most satisfying one, right? There's this thing like flow, I think it lives in this area, where you try to operate on the boundary of your competence.
This might be a different concept, but it keeps coming to mind of like you describing like playing a musical piece. And then there's like this one part that's like the hard part and you just want to get through it. But then you stop and you take the time to actually explore that domain. And I feel like that's like another, it's not, it's like another principle that's related for like the, you know, it's not, that from, yeah, that familiarity and navigability of that part of space.
I think this is actually the counterpoint. Instinctively, I would actually say this is the point where you don't want to travel to. You want to avoid it. It's not just on the boundary. It's really some, I don't want it there. So this is something that also not natural. You have to force yourself to do that because it will make your route much more stable. But this is a decision happening on the high level of your brain where it's consciously a decision where we have to do that because it's good for you. Eat your 5 a day, right? Eat your vegetables because it's good for you, not because you like it. I think that is actually the counterpoint to that. The exploration of incorporation of new knowledge into existing space. It's the doing the unpleasant thing is more learning a new language, completely new language, where there's nothing that helps you. So you learn like something like Finnish, a language there where you say, I want to learn because I want to learn it, not because it's kind of pulling me in. It's really a top-down decision.
There was no space on it at first, very little grip on it, so it's part of the discomfort. Like there's very little that you're able at first to predict about it. Very little you're able to control about it.
Yes, and when I am forced to do things like that, one thing that I do is actually forcing myself to get landmarks in language, for example, vocabulary. So it's something that when I want to develop a language better that I want to pick up, I try to pick up the vocabulary and really very meticulous in getting enough landmarks that once you have the landmarks, you can start navigating. And then, oh, okay, this means that. And then the grammar, I always felt the grammar is something, I'm not talking about Finnish, this is a really, really different language, but I've always felt that grammar is something you could somehow pick up. It's a vocabulary that takes, it is the thing that keeps you from picking it up because you are struggling with the vocabulary and then you think the problem is the grammar. But children pick up grammar very fast. So I think, again, I'm not a language expert. I'm just a passive language learner. But I found that once you have some vocabulary, the grammar is something that kind of moves into place, even if not perfectly so. Interestingly, English, for example, has very minimal grammar, but there are so many things that are implicit to English, and you actually do not realize that until much later. So it's relatively easy to write English that can be deciphered by people, but it's very difficult to write English so that you sound like a native speaker. I'm talking about writing because accent is a different story. I'm talking just about writing. So there is this hierarchy of how you have to specify things like the big red car or this hierarchy in which order I forgot in which order you have to do it, but there are different specifications like the little green French flag. Okay, the French flag is not green, it doesn't matter, but you know, the little red, blue, white French flag. As particular order you have to say it. You say it in another order, it sounds the French little red, blue flag. Doesn't sound right. Or the little French red, blue flag, or the little red, blue French flag. There's a particular order which sounds most natural in English. It's not something that I was conscious about. But I at some point I saw this article and said, well, it's true. You turn it around, it doesn't sound good. Very weird. It's completely implicit. Never learned that in the grammar school. Children pick that up. And the regularity is something that they pick up faster, so they will sometimes regularize forms which are not regular. This is a phenomenon that seems to occur. Humans are good at picking up patterns.
The mass language models seem to be doing fine with grammar.
Yes, I'm actually
quite excellent.
Quite
excellent at it.
They're amazing. I mean, they're amazing. Let's face it, it is. I'm not easily surprised, but this was one of the things that really surprised me when I heard about that. I was like, dang. This is a major step ahead. Many people try to do that. And probably they're right. I mean, the networks seem to be actually picking up the statistical structures. It's a little bit worrying that they actually need the whole internet in a way for this, right? So you need to train on a huge number of samples. No baby learns that, right? If you have a baby that lives in an Amazonas tribe, somewhere in the far Amazonas, they pick up, I mean, they have probably a handful of people around them and still pick up the language, right? So it's very clear we do not need the internet to learn that as humans. We much better at that. The question is why? What is it that presets our understanding of language like that? So that is a reason also why I don't think that, I mean, when people talk it's intelligent, not intelligent, I don't think that that's the right question to ask anyway, right? It's a bit like talking quantum mechanics, is a wave, is a particle. It's just the wrong question. It's not the pertinent part. The question is, what actually creates the gap between what humans do and what machines do? Because clearly they don't do the same thing as we. They do things that look very similar to some aspect, like the grammar and putting language together, but in other aspects they don't. Even the third-rate politician I talked about earlier doesn't have the full internet in his brain or hers. That politician can play with language, may be very good with language without understanding, but still doesn't have necessarily access to the whole library of human knowledge in the form that something like ChatGPT does. So in other words, we have now a problem that clearly it is capturing the right things, but with a completely different approach.
Extremely data inefficient, but massive, but not involving this kind of bootstrapping and leveraging of understandings.
Yes.
That's like an active learning process where you're.
Yes. There's nothing there.
Nothing like that.
Now people try also to do this embodied learning, right? I mean, there is work where they try to link it to Minecraft, and certainly that is a direction that I think is more promising. I still don't think that this addresses what we meant as understanding, right? It may still address, okay, if I do these things, I get these results and I can predict what has happened. It can be very good, like, you know, AlphaGo was amazing in beating humans because it simply had a full picture of what the statistics look for the future states. It doesn't mean that it understood what it was doing. Again, understood in the sense that it has detachable way of looking at the problem. So I think I mentioned this example before. There are chess positions which are virtually intractable for a machine, but where even a not very advanced human can immediately see that how they defend that position. So I think like positions that depend on a bishop only being on one color. That's a classic example of that. How can a machine that doesn't understand the concept of parity and of the fact that the bishop cannot move to the other thing will make this position unassailable?
And that's how we beat AlphaGo recently, right? Like that's what Stuart Russell did. There was like a concept, I think, of like there was some like higher level concept that the machine could not track, and then that was used as the, you know.
I mean, you could probably still train it with this concept, but the point is that humans would be able to do that again and again. I mean, science fiction is full of that, of course, right? Many science fiction movies rely on the fact that humans somehow jump out of the system, utilize the system to some extent, and break it by actually getting the machine to utilize itself. Or the aliens, right? The aliens are treated like hyperlogical beings, and then they get utilized by the humans. I mean, the funniest one is, of course, Independence Day, right? I mean, where these guys ride up and put a virus into the aliens' computer. Of course, this doesn't sound very plausible if these aliens are any good, but I do think that there is an element of that at this point with AI, that the AI does the syntax, but that cannot handle the semantics. I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm not saying this is absolutely unreachable. I believe there's nothing magic about this. There's a reason why humans can do that. Question is, what is it? We don't understand.
Present efforts to do things like grounding via embodied learning in like a Minecraft, like micro meso world, you think that's insufficient for really? I have a similar intuition, but I'm curious to.
I think it's a very big step ahead. Yes, it will help. I think that it may not yet. It doesn't do the ultimate step. Yeah, so I think it's a very important one. I think understanding context is an important one. I think actually understanding the recursive nature of knowledge is critical. I keep saying to my students, actually, students don't like recursion very much. They are afraid of it. They don't like it. They think it's scary and it's difficult, and it's probably not very useful either. And so I keep saying to them one thing. I keep saying to them that if they go into superhero movies, well, these superheroes can do this and that and magic and make things fly and explode and fireballs and so on. I say there's one true superpower that humans have. That's one true superpower, and that is the ability to do recursion. That's a true superpower, and I mean it, because it's something that we are not. I don't think that animals can do that so well, if at all. I think you need language for that, or language needs recursion, or they need each other. And of course, once you have writing, you can do recursion on steroids. And one aspect about recursion is that you talk about the system inside the system itself. So it's a kind of form of proto-girdling. You basically, I ended up with Gödel somehow. I don't know. I didn't choose to go, but this is the route we took. Fair enough. So you look at the system from the system, and you can talk about it partly from outside. This is a very weird thing to do. It's a very weird thing to do, to be honest. And it's also a language game. But as we talked earlier about Lisp, it's very chaotic if you do it randomly. You can't just do it randomly. It doesn't work randomly. You need to know what you're doing. You need to have and understanding what it means to step out of the system for this to work at all. You can't just, you could do genetic programming and you get to some point. I do think it becomes combinatorially unfeasible with a system that bootstraps itself to do that. You need to understand what you're doing. You need to understand what are legal ways to look from outside on your syntactic system. And how do you find them? Well, that is a very great mystery. That's a great mystery. I think that is definitely one thing that we need to resolve, apart from context, to be able to do that. Maybe it has to do with context, actually. Maybe exactly that. That is actually understanding that context can be stepping out of the system. I'm now in a different context. I'm now looking at the sentence as the object of my contemplation.
I wonder, so like earlier I was thinking of like continuing with like the navigation framing of intelligence and wondering like when we encounter obstacles or the idea of looking for a shortcut, and then of course back to the hippocampus as this kind of navigation system and wondering the extent to which that was repurposed for high level cognition. But then I guess this idea though of like, I don't know how much, interestingly, that was actually there was a great hippocampus debate in the 1900s about like whether that was a source of human uniqueness based on like the hippocampus minor. I think Huxley was pushing for that as like a source maybe of like of creative genius in humans, but I think he was on that side. But how much of it is the ability to take a fictive or an allocentric or a fictive egocentric perspective on yourself to like imagine, so how much that trick, how much is that the key of the flexibility of the counterfactuals and of the ability to step out and step in again, like seeing yourself from without?
Counterfactual is one thing, right? I don't think you need to step out from yourself, but I completely agree with you. Yes, ability to step out of yourself. That is probably an element of recursion. The ability of actually saying this is as if I was looking at somebody else. This is basically theory of mind on steroids. Because you have to actually be able to fool yourself. There's not a good reason why people like games like chess, because if you play chess, you play against yourself. You can think about playing against yourself, right? There's something very fundamentally recursive about it. In the way it's formulated. Okay, you play it against another one, but if you want to play well, you play mentally against yourself in a way. Something very recursive about it. So yes, I agree.
What if I were different? What if I thought differently?
Yes. Of course, at some point it gets difficult. So there are these games where you try to fool yourself, it doesn't work, and then you have to do game theory to formalize that. As I say, technique is your friend if your intuitive mind lets you down. That's why it's so powerful to make technique formal. That's why math is so powerful. The moment you write math down, it becomes a technique. And that moment, it doesn't depend on you being the right mood and taking the right perspective. You can just put these blocks on the table and they keep do the bookkeeping for you. So externalizing math and making good formalisms.
You said you put it on steroids, the power, like once you can write it down.
Yes. Yes. But there are two. The first one, what I said, recursion is theory of mind on steroids.
The recursion theory of mind on steroids, but then, writing.
And then you're right. I agree. Writing stuff down is that stuff on steroids again. Because you can now externalize that and treat it as, and also the good thing about writing down is that you can do bookkeeping now, right? The bookkeeping is now done by the written word, which maintains, essentially, you don't have to load in your mind, you don't have to keep everything balancing, juggling, very careful in your mind. It's now on the table, and now it externalizes part of the treatment. If that's why good notation is so useful. If notation is bad, essentially part of the juggling remains in your mind. You still have to juggle the notation, what it means, or you have to learn it or not. But if it's good notation, you juggle less. The bookkeeping is still there, but you juggle less.
I'm hesitant to say this, but I wonder, in terms of like bootstrapping extended self processes and allocentric perspectives in the self, like to what degree was like, when did we start, like, so to what degree can you get at this just from like interacting with others and different types of like mirroring relations, and like, but to what degree actually did we, like, kind of like writing was actually drawing and painting, like were cave paintings actually important potentially as providing like part of like what made some things evolvable, what basically gave you some toeholds to launch you into different regimes, like was like creating some externalizations of that kind, or was it just all in our behavioral ecology of like the way we interacted both like dyadically and multi-person interactions that just gave us opportunities to like get these to infer these representations. But like, did actually drawing pictures of beings that might be us in different contexts, other people, did that actually help us to
This is a really interesting idea. I never thought of that, but now that you say it, it is definitely a hypothesis of interest. I mean, we know that there's the first astronomical record that was taken, as far as I know, is 30,000 years old. It's basically the moon phases. So somebody obviously understood that this is the same object, and it passes through these phases over time. It's a simple idea, right? But 30,000 years ago, we could say this is probably a brilliant observer, this guy or gal. The question is now, if you go, I don't know when kind of scratching stuff on walls started, but I really like this idea that language might have been bootstrapped in a non-obvious way by externalizing and permanentizing, horrible word, permanentizing concepts. So you paint a hand, and now this is a hand, and okay, we can show a hand and so on, but suddenly it's on this cave wall or somewhere, and then they make some oog noises, and suddenly this thing gains a concept of its own. It becomes depersonalized, because that, in my opinion, is the key for language. The key for language is that a concept does not die with its carrier, but actually it doesn't need the carrier. It travels through other carriers, even if the first carrier is not around anymore. I think that is the key for language. Basically, I like to call it like that. Information wants to be free, right? So, or memes want to be free. It's basically the freeing the memes. They can move. They're not confined to that one person. So there's an example which I really like, and I bring it up every time again because it's really fascinating. So the classic example is that if you are a Polynesian in the great time of the Polynesian expansion, there are two major waves, and these were the best navigators before essentially the Columbian times. So they traveled much further than anyone else. The Vikings had also quite big trips, but not as anywhere close to the Polynesians. So even the Greeks who had math that were not moving far from the coastline. They didn't like to do that. So the Polynesians traveled very far and very wide, and their navigators were highly respected members of society. They were basically a good navigator the status was above a chief, and with good reason, because it took 20, 30 years to become a good navigator. Now they had this knowledge, and you would learn it, and there was some lore, and there was some maps, but there was a big conglomerate of facts that they had to deal with.
And your life is very unambiguously in the navigator's hands. If they're
And
not good.
Yeah, you can't just transfer it. You can't just teach it easily, right? It's very, very much tied to the person of the navigator. What distinguishes, say, European navigation from that is there's some math, some trigonometry. You can learn it if you are relatively talented. You can learn it in a few years, 2-3 years, and you can become a competent navigator. Probably takes longer, but you can get the point, right? It's something that's learnable, something that has technique, to put it this way. It's not to a large extent is I wouldn't say it's talent free, but you need much less talent and much less aptitude to be reasonably competent at that than a Polynesian navigator. And this is communicable. And I think that's what language does. It frees the ideas. They become independent, not only from the carrier, but from the originator too. So it is actually possible to originate a new idea, complex idea that nobody else, say Einstein or Newton, could have formulated, but suddenly everybody can use it. It becomes accessible to everyone.
It's, I mean, shareable both. It's useful in the sharing, but I'm wondering, like, in terms of this, the discussion of like understanding and like having multiple core screens you can move between it, or like once you give it to someone else, they then use it differently, and they're exploring different aspects, yes, different facets and different combinations. And as you're kicking it back and forth, this is basically keeping you from just the single vision and the one overfit part, but now you actually, and not just that, but not just exploring different facets, but also the combinatorics and the building of structure upon structure that would happen collaboratively. So that's where it takes off. Like that's where mind really like
yes, and that is exactly why people think that, I mean, Stuart Kaufman has this the adjacent possible. Yeah. So I think it taps into that. Sorry for the pun, because he calls it theory tap. That is possible when you have a good communication, right? Something that's easy to adopt, easy to manipulate. And then if you give me an object and I can't turn it around, I have only always to keep it, this side up, then okay, this is a very clunky object. I can use it exactly the way that you gave it to me. I can't do anything else with that. But if it's an object that is very easy to rotate and motivate and modify and deal with, then it becomes something that I can do other things with, exactly as you say. Suddenly, I see other aspects. Suddenly, there's understanding. I say, oh, you can use, this is a brick. I can use it to build houses. No, but you can use it to hunt an antelope. Or you can use it, for example, to put something on it and sit on it. So it becomes, the understanding becomes this multitude of overlaying processes.
But then yes. like in a way, I guess, kind of coming back to like the earlier example of like DNA, but it's like, but it's also like, it seems like you need this separability in order basically to have cumulative evolution, period. Like, so in addition to this, like being the search process, to have the cumulative aspect, Like if it's just you, it goes down. If you're just the Polynesian navigator, it's lost with you. But people can iterate on it over deep time. So you can,
Yes.
there's the remixing, there's a parallelization of the search, there's the
Yes.
combinatorics, and there's the extended part of it. In other
Yes.
words, uh-huh.
Well, this has had to be compact though, because if
Memes
it's
want to
very
be free,
complicated,
so they
sorry?
can evolve. Memes want to be free to evolve.
Yes, it has to be small enough though. If it's too complicated, the problem is that you end up with a dilemma of the Polynesian navigator. There are very few people that can do it, and it's hard to reproduce and hard to modify. You can use it only as it is. So the trick here is always, that's why I'm saying notions are important. Notions are critical, and that's why if something is very complicated, you have to simplify it. You find a new coordinate system. You have to find a new understanding, a new way of dealing with it. There can be multiple ones. And that's why understanding is hard, because if you want to have multiples at the same time, that requires effort. Yes, and I do think that our time has kind of also runs course. It's getting late here too. So I do think that's a good point to.
I disagree, but I do have to leave soon.
Yeah, no, I think I'm also my agenda is extremely long, so I don't have actually good excuses to do other things. I have to go back to it, but I do think that we traveled far and wide, and I think we covered a couple of things. I do think that bottom line, when we ask about AI, yes, it's a problem, it's a challenge. We probably can discuss that next time a bit more in detail, what should be done, what could be done. But I do think that the concept of understanding is still eluding it, in the sense that I feel that it needs to be stated. I do think also that the volume of training data that we need at this stage is so huge that it's very clearly not understanding what it's doing. It's rote learning. It's a bit like certain people who do learn everything in the book. They know everything in the book. You ask them a question that's slightly different from the way it's written in the book, and they can't answer it because they just don't get what you're saying.
Not quite a stochastic parrot, but a stochastic savant.
Yeah, I think that just overtraining. You really need to be able to zoom in and out and zoom into different directions. And the more you can do that, the more understanding you have. That's not trivial, and we don't know how to do that at this stage. But I think that's a challenge. Of course, we have to ask ourselves: do we want this? I do think it's not really a question of whether it can be stopped, because unfortunately, it will happen one way or the other. So what we have to prepare for is what happens when it happens. What next? What's the next step? I don't think we are there yet, but I'm careful making any predictions, because the time scale is highly nonlinear, which we operate. I was always a bit skeptical about the issue of the singularity, but let's put it this way: one needs to be a little bit cautious in time predictions, and I'm cautious in time predictions. I think the effects will also be different from what people expect. It's very hard to predict what will happen and how the disruption will exactly look like. I don't think that when computer was invented in the 40s, people would think that you would use computers for writing letters and for showing cat videos.
Inventors of the internet weren't thinking about blockchains, and inventors of.
And I'm sure that the people who played around with magnets did not think that one day the whole world will run on electromagnetism.
Next time I'm looking forward to digging in deeper into that landscape. So
Will do. Will
thank
do.
you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.